Welcome to the podcast of the Marxist Workers' Party. We are in conversation with Wiseman Hamilton, General Secretary of the Marxist Workers' Party, the South African affiliate of the Committee for Workers International. How are you, Wiseman? Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, and hi to all your viewers.
All right, thank you. Let's all immediately into our discussion for today. We recently saw the brazen abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on sovereign soil. The U.S. claims that the abduction was justified as a war against narco-terrorism and to reclaim oil fields the Venezuelan government had taken from U.S. companies. Is this unprecedented?
It is shocking without a doubt. And I think for many across the world who are not familiar with the history of US imperialist intervention, particularly in Latin America, this may seem unprecedented. But in reality, it's not the first time that the US has resorted to such gangster methods that hark back to the gunboat diplomacy of the last century. There have been several attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, for example. They've arrested the president of Panama, Noriega, just before the abduction of Maduro. They released from prison the former president of Honduras, whom they hypocritically charged with the crimes that they induced him to commit involving drug trafficking. In this particular instance, the charge that that Maduro was in charge of some cartel was laughed out of court, really. And they themselves had to concede that it was an invention and therefore the charges were dropped. Incidentally, the US has included in its modus operandi for intervention, particularly in the neo-colonial world, organizing network of drug trafficking. They've done that in Afghanistan. They've done that in Latin America. They did that in Southeast Asia. So it is, in that sense, nothing new. But so is the act of kidnapping. For a South African audience, they may be interested to know that South Africa granted refuge to the first elected president of Venezuela, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, after he had been kidnapped at gunpoint together with his wife by the US as they instigated a far-right coup against his democratically elected government in 2004. The US colluding with forces that they had armed within Haiti, together with the French, who have never forgiven the people of Haiti for the slave rebellion of over 200 years ago. So in that sense, it's not unprecedented, even though it feels like that. I think the important question is, why has the US resorted to these methods? Trump, for example, has openly threatened that they will assassinate the Ayatollah in Iran, casually stating that the Ayatollah should be very concerned and that if they don't concede to the demands of US imperialism in the current negotiations, he might be taken out, not just kidnapped. So this is perfectly in tune with the methods of a regime which under US imperialism has carried out interventions, occupations, regime change, assassinations, etc., without paying the scantest respect to the so-called rules-based order that they were the architects of at the end of World War II, and which they have now openly committed themselves to dismantling.
Thank you. Since the abduction, the US has embarked on the intensified economic strangulation of Cuba after 80 years of sanctions and amassed warships, fighter jets, and other weapons of war to attack Iran. It was followed by a speech to the Munich Security Conference by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, stating that Western powers are in decline, that after World War II, the US and Europe had united against godless communist revolutions and anti-colonial struggles that threatened Western civilization. He declared that the Trump administration is committed to restoring this Western civilization. What is the significance of this fiery speech that he?
I think that the distinguishing feature of particularly the Trump regime in its second incarnation is that they have abandoned all pretenses on the basis of which the post-World War II order was constructed under their supervision. They constructed the United Nations with its UN Security Council built-in veto, where 5 countries can overrule 190, as if they don't exist. They constructed economically an order that was calculated to keep the neo-colonial world in particular in a state of permanent economic subjugation. And the main instruments for that order were the World Trade Organization that began its life as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Bank, and the IMF. And essentially, the economic subjugation of the neo-colonial world was effected by giving these institutions the power to determine the prices that could be paid, that would have to be paid for the importation of finished goods, capital equipment, technology by these countries, as well as the prices that importing countries would pay for the exports of the neo-colonial world as far as raw materials, agricultural products are concerned. And the latter almost always was far less in the foreign exchange earnings for the neo-colonial countries than the cost of the importation of finished goods, capital equipment, and so forth that they needed for the development of their own economies. US imperialism then created, with the collaboration of European institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, to enable these countries to make loans to cover the shortfall from their foreign exchange earnings through exports, to be able to import the capital goods, machinery, and technology they needed for their own development. The consequence of this arrangement was that the neo-colonial world was thrown into unrepayable debt. Moreover, with the financial regime that the US imposed and reinforced after abandoning the gold standard in 1971, countries were compelled to pay for any imports as well as for oil in dollars. And this actually deepened the dependence, poverty, and underdevelopment of the neo-colonial world. The result of this is that what is today known as the Global South are have been subjected up until the year 2023 to an extraction of over $30 million an hour by the global north, the advanced capitalist countries. The effect of this is that there's been a growing disparity in inequalities in the distribution of wealth. Up until 2025 alone, the increase in the wealth of the world's billionaires could have paid for the cost of the eradication of poverty 26 times over. We have an eye-watering gulf between the earnings of the top 1% of the world's population, whose interests the US and the European capitalists and their quislings in the neo-colonial world have brought about. The world's richest 1% have accumulated over 33.9 trillion in wealth since 2015, while billions are struggling with inflation and stagnant incomes. More than 60 countries in the neo-colonial world spend more than 10% of their budgets merely on servicing debt. The IMF and the World Bank, the IMF in particular, is notorious for imposing on those countries that are compelled to go begging for loans from them conditions that require the slashing of spending on social services, education, health, food, and transport subsidies. So the entire arrangement that was constructed under the supervision of US imperialism has ensured not only the continued underdevelopment, but the widening gap between rich and poor across the world, including, by the way, within the US itself. So this is the world order that Marco Rubio committed himself in his speech to the Munich Security Conference in dismantling. So the obvious question would be, if the global north, if imperialism has had it as good as they're having it by the figures that I've indicated here, why would they want to dismantle this system? The reason is that the world capitalist system, particularly US imperialism, is in its deepest crisis since the 1930s. We've had, if you like, the rumblings in advance of the tectonic plates on which the post-World War II order was constructed economically. We've seen those rumblings several times in the post-war period, beginning with the increase in the price of oil after the first war in the Middle East that Israel faced against a number of Arab countries. We saw that again with the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 1999-2000. We saw it again with the 2008 global financial crisis. We saw it again with the COVID pandemic, and we are beginning to see all the signs beginning to mature for yet a new crisis in the next period. That's one side of it. The second side of it is that the domination of US imperialism has been undermined economically by the rise of China and has been dislodged as the manufacturing powerhouse of the global economy that underpinned the economic and political and military power that it had previously exercised. And what Rubio was announcing is that the US has recognized that the very institutions that it had created so that it could impose its rule on the world at the end of World War II has failed to arrest its decline. And therefore, they are dismantling that system and replacing it with a new order based on the naked, undisguised, unapologetic assertion of the commitment of US imperialism to unchallenged domination, and are hoping to achieve this by military means. And that explains what they are attempting to do so far as Iran is concerned. So we are faced with the danger that an attack on Iran, which has been subjected by the US and Israel to provocative attacks in the past, including the assassination of senior leaders, and has reacted to be quite frank, not in a way proportional to the attacks that they had been subjected to. But what they are now confronted with, the Iranian regime, is an existential threat to the existence of the regime itself.
Yeah.
And it may therefore have no alternative but to retaliate.
That brings us to the next question. The US appears set on a strike on Iran. Could this lead to World War III, perhaps nuclear war? What do you think?
Yeah, let me answer that question in two parts. I think, look, it is perfectly understandable that there would be a fear amongst people throughout the world that this could escalate into a world war. There have been 2 world wars before, after all. Leaving aside the hundreds of wars that the US has carried out in the period since World War II, that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, that when you have language as unapologetic, as brazen, and insulting as those words uttered by Rubio become part of the normal language previously hidden under diplomatic pretenses. And if you saw in the recent period that the abduction of Maduro was preceded by the assembly of military machinery off the coast of Venezuela, and the shooting down of people with sophisticated US aircraft, of people traveling in boats under the pretense that those people were engaged in drug smuggling. There is every reason to fear that this time, with the assembly of all these forces in far greater numbers, with far greater potency at its disposal in terms of firepower, that it is likely that an attack will be carried out. But we should not forget that in the case of Venezuela, the US elected to carry out a gangster-like abduction rather than to put boots on the ground, because it feared the consequences of resistance developing not only within the Venezuelan population, but the entire Latin America against such a brazen assertion of US imperial power. So they held back. But it would appear that there was no doubt left in anybody's mind that resistance against US imperialism is futile. Precisely how they are going to go about such an attack is unclear, but they are doing so in circumstances that are radically different from the period that prevailed immediately after World War II, right up into the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, where the power of US imperialism was more or less unchallenged. This time, however, economically speaking, it has been overtaken by China in manufacturing, in technology, in the production of solar goods, electric vehicles, and so forth. And therefore, the strength of the US dollar, by the way, is not a reflection of the strength of the US economy any longer. They fear that, economically speaking, the grip that they previously had will be decisively weakened, and they want to arrest that process and believe that the way to do that is to prevent any further consolidation of China's rise through the links that it has with Iran, which also, by the way, has strengthened its trade relations with Russia as well. In the military training exercises at sea, both Russia and China have sent warships to engage in these war games with Iran. It is not a certainty that they will activate those wars, but I think most people are reasonably apprehensive about what this would mean, potentially. It is also taking place against the background of the fact that the last remaining treaty to prevent a nuclear war, to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, has not been renewed. It expired on February the 6th. And that has acted as a deterrent to some degree against a nuclear war. The problem now is that, unlike at the time when these agreements were entered into between Russia primarily and the US at the time, the Soviet Union, the potency of atomic weaponry is magnified by several orders of magnitude compared to what happened then. Let's remember that the US remains the only country to have dropped an atom bomb, incinerating in 1945 between 200,000 and 300,000 in Nagasaki, and at least 150,000 in Hiroshima. And the fear, as Russia has matched the production of nuclear weapons, the former Soviet Union, and actually has, at this point in time, slightly more nuclear warheads in its arsenal than the US, by a few hundred. It's between 6,000, 5,000 and something for the US, and over 6,000 for Russia. That they are aware that any introduction of nuclear weapons into war today will lead to the destruction of the planet itself. The doctrine under which it has acted as a deterrent is known as MAD appropriately, mutually assured destruction. It is the fear of this madness that has held back a nuclear war. But there's been a proliferation. We have a genocidal regime in Israel that the Western powers have colluded in concealing its nuclear capabilities. It has about 300 nuclear warheads in its arsenal. If you have that kind of regime that has insulated itself against public opinion and the potential consequences of their action in the way that it has acted in relation to Palestine and the people in Gaza, if you have quasi-military dictatorships in countries like Pakistan, if you have a far-right regime like you have in India, the normal checks that could possibly hold back a nuclear war have been weakened. And now there is no treaty. In addition to that, in military intelligence circles in both the UK as well as the US, there have been discussions, as revealed by Open Secrets, amongst these officials that are questioning the doctrine of no first strike. In other words, nobody will be the first to use it. That is under review in parts of the establishment. And therefore, we cannot rule it out that might happen. Of course, it will provoke a tumultuous response from ordinary people. And that too they fear. But it is a fear that nobody can win a nuclear war, because it will destroy the whole of humanity along with the planet itself. And that, I think, still holds for now. But that is not going to prevent them from carrying out an attack. They will have been emboldened by what had happened, by what they could regard as a success, especially since the Rodriguez-led regime in Venezuela is collaborating now with Trump, and that would have boosted their confidence, and they may well go. But what Iran has threatened in retaliation is that all the military bases in the Middle East owned by the US will be legitimate targets. And what Iran demonstrated in the war last year, the 12-day war, is that its missiles are capable of penetrating the air defenses despite the additional air defense weaponry that they received from the US at the time. And those are the factors that I think are influencing the timing of events.
Yes.
The final point that I will make is that should the US carry out these assassinations, they are fantasizing that what will happen is that the regime will collapse and it will be replaced by the type of regime against which the 1979 revolution was fought, and even have lined up the grandson or the son of the Shah at that time to step in. It will not happen. It is a much bigger population, 90 million strong, and there will be a revolt. And if they dare to put in troops, they will suffer the same consequences as they did in Vietnam, where they were defeated, as they did in Afghanistan, where they had to leave in humiliation, as they did in Iraq, where they've left behind chaos, as they did in Libya. Nothing that is being promised by Rubio through the reassertion of unchallenged US imperial power promises anything that anybody on the planet can have any confidence in. And this is a demonstration of the necessity for working people throughout the world to mobilize to overthrow capitalism as the most effective way of putting an end to the threat to humanity of US and European imperialism.
Yes, it's a very important point, General Secretary, because in conclusion, how should the working class and the socialist movements react to these developments?
When World War I broke out, there was an international that had been brought into existence in the late 1800s, the Second International. It was a powerful international organization of the working class. Regrettably, the leaders, key leaders, like the German Social Democratic Party especially, had degenerated and therefore supported the German government in the declaration of war. When Lenin read the reports, he thought it was a forgery by the German General Staff, because central to the policy of socialism is internationalism and no support for imperialist wars. The slogan that was put forward by Liebknecht, the German revolutionary that was later assassinated, along with Rosa Luxemburg, was the main enemy of the working class is at home. Not many people realize that what brought World War I to an end were two developments. One, the overthrow of capitalism and landlordism in Russia in what remains the greatest event in human history to date, the October Revolution of 1917. And a year later, the uprising by the German working class, who carried out a general strike that collapsed the ability of the German bourgeoisie to continue the offensive. That potential power of the working class remains undiminished. On the contrary, that power is potentially far greater than it was at that time. The missing ingredient in all the attempts that the working class has embarked upon throughout the period of history since the October Revolution in 1917 has been the absence of the type of political party organizing and uniting the working class and the peasants in Russia, the Bolsheviks, in any other countries. The result of this is that even though workers rose up heroically, they suffered defeat after defeat because the political party that they needed was absent. Our responsibility today is to recreate the equivalent of the Bolshevik Party, mass workers' parties on a socialist program in every country in the world, to bring them together under the umbrella of a mass working class international on a socialist program. Because what is at stake here is not just the choice that Rosa Luxemburg and James Colony of Ireland spoke about, a choice between socialism and barbarism, which the majority of the people in the neo-colonial world are in any event living through. But it is a choice between the future of humanity and the salvation of humanity on the basis of the overthrow of this barbaric system of capitalism, presided over, as we can see now by the Epstein revelations, the most depraved ruling class, at least since the Roman Empire in decline.
Thank you so much, General Secretary. It brings us to the end of our podcast. We appreciate your time and your in-depth knowledge on the subject. Until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Amandla!